There is a photograph from Baghdad in the early 1950s, not famous, not reproduced in the monographs, of a house on the banks of the Tigris, modern in the way that word meant something different then. All clean lines and generous windows, a house that believed in the future without irony. The light is golden and flat, the way afternoon light becomes in that part of the world, and somewhere inside, though you cannot see her, is a small girl who has not yet learned that buildings can be impossible, that forms can be called unbuildable, that there are shapes the world will refuse to let you make. She is too young to know any of this. She knows only that her father's library smells of paper and leather, that her mother wears dresses from Paris, that the river moves past the garden in a language older than any the adults around her speak. Her name is Zaha, and she will spend the rest of her life making buildings that look like they are still moving, still becoming, still refusing to settle into the geometries the 20th century thought were inevitable. Baghdad in those years was a city of enormous confidence. It had oil wealth, certainly, but more than that, it had a sense of itself as a place that could be modern and Middle Eastern at once, that did not have to choose between heritage and futurity. The architecture reflected this. Frank Lloyd Wright had been invited to design an opera house and cultural center on an island in the Tigris. It was never built, but the invitation itself was a statement: we belong to the world, and the world belongs to us. Zaha's father, Mohammad Hadid, was an industrialist and a founding member of the Iraqi National Democratic Party, a progressive who believed in secular democracy, in education, in the possibility that Iraq could find its own path. Her mother, Wajiha Sabunji, had trained as an artist. The household was intellectual, cosmopolitan, multilingual. There were books in English and Arabic and French. There were dinner parties with politicians and architects and writers. There was music. The house itself, designed by her father with help from architects who admired Le Corbusier, was a testament to a particular vision of modernity, rational, humane, full of light. Zaha was the eldest of 3 children. She attended a Catholic school run by French nuns, then a Jesuit school, absorbing languages and disciplines with the easy fluency of a child who has never been told she cannot do something. The city around her was changing rapidly. New buildings rose along the riverfront. The streets widened. The souks remained ancient and labyrinthine, but they coexisted with cinema houses and modernist villas, with university campuses designed by foreign architects who came to Baghdad the way they once went to Brasilia or Chandigarh, believing they were building the future. It was a brief moment, historically speaking, a window of maybe 15 years, when Baghdad felt like it could become anything. Zaha absorbed it all: the confidence, the hybridity, the sense that culture was not a fixed thing, but a conversation that could include anyone willing to speak. She was 10 when her aunt took her to see the ancient Sumerian cities in southern Iraq. Uruk, Eridu, places that had been among the first cities in human history, where ziggurats rose from the flat desert like abstract sculptures, like geometric dreams made solid. The ruins were not picturesque. They were stark, eroded, almost geological in their weathered simplicity. But they were also unmistakably made, unmistakably intentional. Someone had wanted those shapes to exist. Someone had moved earth and brick to make those sloping walls, those massive platforms, those forms that seemed to rise from the ground as if the ground itself had decided to become architecture. Zaha would later say that those ruins stayed with her, that the ziggurats taught her something about mass and line, about how a building could be both of the earth and utterly alien to it. She did not use the word influence. She was suspicious of that kind of direct causality, but you can see it if you look. The way her buildings seemed to emerge from their sites rather than sit on them. The way she refused the orthogonal. The way her forms have that same quality of inevitability and strangeness that the ziggurats possess, as though they had always been there and had just now chosen to reveal themselves. She was good at mathematics, not just competent, genuinely talented, the kind of student who could see patterns and relationships that others missed. Her parents encouraged her. There was no question that she would go to university, no suggestion that her gender should limit her ambitions. In 1968, she left Baghdad for Beirut, enrolling at the American University to study mathematics. Beirut in the late 60s was another city in the midst of a brief, bright flowering, cosmopolitan, glamorous, politically engaged, a place where students argued about Sartre and Fanon in coffee houses, where the future seemed like something you could argue into being. Zaha was 18, stylish, intellectually restless. She wore her dark hair short. She had strong features, a face that photographs made dramatic. She was not interested in making herself smaller or quieter. She studied abstract algebra and topology, disciplines concerned with structure and transformation, with the deep patterns underlying shape and space. But mathematics, for all its beauty, was not enough, or rather, it was complete in a way that left her unsettled. The problems were elegant, the solutions precise, but there was no material residue, no object in the world that changed because you had solved them. Architecture, when she began to consider it, offered something different. It was equally concerned with geometry and space, but it required those concerns to become physical, to negotiate with gravity and material and human bodies, with money and politics and the messy contingencies of the real. It was mathematics plus everything mathematics left out. She finished her degree in mathematics in 1971, and then she made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She applied to the Architectural Association in London, the AA, a school known for its experimental ethos, its resistance to conventional pedagogy, its belief that architecture could be a form of radical inquiry rather than a professional training. She was accepted. In the autumn of 1972, at the age of 22, Zaha Hadid arrived in London. The city was grey and damp and nothing like Baghdad or Beirut. The AA, housed in a Georgian building on Bedford Square in Bloomsbury, was small, intense, intellectually combative. It was not a place that taught you how to build houses or office blocks, at least not primarily. It was a place that taught you how to think about what architecture could be, what it might become if you refused all the assumptions that made it safe and predictable. The school was organized into units, each led by a different architect or theorist, each pursuing its own agenda. Students chose which unit to join, and the units competed for attention, for the best students, for the most radical propositions. It was more like an art school than a professional program. The studios stayed open all night. The critiques were brutal. The coffee was terrible. People smoked constantly. There was a sense that something important was happening, that the language of architecture was being rewritten in real time. Zaha joined Unit 9, led by Rem Koolhaas and Elia Zenhelis. Koolhaas was only a few years older than most of his students, a former journalist and screenwriter who had come to architecture late, burning with impatience and ideas. Zengelis was a Greek architect with a background in painting, someone who believed that architectural drawings should be beautiful in themselves, not just technical documents but images that could seduce and provoke. Together they were pushing the unit toward a kind of architecture that took its cues from constructivism, from suprematism, from the Russian avant-garde of the 1920s, movements that had imagined architecture as a revolutionary practice, a way of making a new world, rather than decorating the old one. The drawings that came out of Unit 9 were unlike anything being done elsewhere, large, painterly, full of explosive color and dynamic lines, depicting buildings that seemed to hover or collide, that refused to sit still on the page. Zaha thrived. She had found the context she needed. Koolhaas recognized her talent immediately. Years later, he would say that her work as a student was already extraordinary, that she had an ability to visualize space that he had never seen before, that her drawings were not representations of buildings but events, explosions of form that made you feel architecture rather than simply look at it. She worked obsessively. The AA culture rewarded this, the all-nighters, the intensity, the willingness to destroy a drawing and start over at 3 a.m. because something was not right. She developed a graphic style that was entirely her own, sharp diagonals, overlapping planes, a sense of multiple viewpoints colliding on a single sheet of paper, as though the building were being seen from several places at once, or as though it were moving too quickly to be captured in a single frame. Her lines were confident, almost violent. Her colors, reds and blacks and whites, vibrated against each other. The drawings looked like they might leap off the page. Her thesis project, completed in 1977, was a hotel on the Hungerford Bridge over the Thames. The bridge was a real place, an old railway bridge that pedestrians used to cross the river, but Zaha treated it as a site for formal speculation. Her hotel was not a building in the conventional sense. It was a collection of fragments of intersecting planes and cantilevered volumes that seemed to explode across the bridge, to occupy the space above the water without ever fully touching down. The drawings were astonishing, huge, meticulously rendered, full of strange perspectives and impossible geometries. The project made no concessions to buildability, to budget, to the concerns that normally constrain architectural design. It was pure vision, pure formal invention. The jury at the AA understood that they were looking at something unprecedented. She was awarded the diploma with distinction. Rem Koolhaas told her she was a planet in her own orbit. But a diploma from the AA, however brilliant, did not automatically translate into work. Architecture is a profession that requires clients, budgets, permissions, construction teams. It requires buildings, not just drawings. Zaha stayed in London after graduation. She began working for Koolhaas's practice, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, which he had founded with Elia and Zoe Zankelis and Madeline Vriesendorp. OMA was inventing a new way of working, research-heavy, conceptually rigorous, willing to engage with the ideological and economic forces that shaped cities rather than pretending architecture existed in some autonomous aesthetic realm. Zaha worked on competition entries, on theoretical projects, on urban master plans that would never be built. She was good at it. She understood how to think at the scale of the city, how to diagram relationships and flows, how to make an argument through drawing. But she was also beginning to chafe. OMA was Rem's practice, Rem's vision. She had her own ideas, her own formal language, and it was becoming clear that it would not fit within someone else's office. In 1979, she opened her own practice. She was 29 years old. She had almost no money, no commissions, no reputation outside the small world of the AA and its alumni. Her office was a room in Eaton Place, Belgravia, shared with other young architects who were equally broke and equally convinced that they were going to change the world. She entered competitions. Competitions were the only way for an unknown architect to gain visibility, to propose ideas to a public audience, to imagine buildings for real sites, even if those buildings would probably never be built. Most competitions are not won by radicals. Juries tend to prefer safety, especially when choosing someone to build something expensive and permanent. But occasionally, very occasionally, a jury decides to be brave, or a project is so compelling that even a conservative jury cannot ignore it. Zaha entered dozens of competitions in the early 1980s. She won almost none of them. Her designs were too strange, too uncompromising, too far from anything that had been built before. Clients did not know how to read them. Engineers did not know how to estimate them. They looked impossible. But in 1982, she won a competition that changed everything. The Irish Prime Minister, Charles Haughey, had a brother who owned land on the outskirts of Dublin and wanted to develop it as a private members' club. A competition was announced for the Peak, a leisure club on a steep hillside overlooking Hong Kong's Victoria Harbour. The site was dramatic, a sharp slope covered in vegetation, with panoramic views of the city and the water below. The brief called for a club with a swimming pool, restaurants, social spaces, and a sense of exclusivity. 80 entries were submitted. Zaha's was unlike any of them. She treated the hillside not as a surface to build on, but as a landscape to fracture and reassemble. Her design showed the building as a series of sharply angled planes that seemed to have been blasted out of the hillside and then frozen mid-explosion, hovering over the slope like geological shards. The perspectives were vertiginous, dynamic, almost cinematic. You could not tell where the building ended and the hillside began. It was as though the site itself had erupted into architecture. The jury was chaired by a Japanese architect, and it included several figures from the international architectural avant-garde. They chose Zaha's design unanimously. The announcement made headlines. At 32, she was suddenly famous, at least within the architecture world. The Peak was published in every major journal. It appeared in exhibitions. Students studied it. Critics debated it. Some called it visionary. Others called it ridiculous, unbuildable, an exercise in formal gymnastics that ignored the practical realities of construction. Both assessments were partly true. The Peak was visionary, absolutely, but it was also, in the end, not built. The client ran out of money, or lost interest, or was spooked by the design's radicalism. The reasons were never entirely clear. The site remained empty. The building existed only as drawings, as paintings, as a series of astonishing images that circulated to the architectural press like a rumor of a future that had not yet arrived. This became a pattern. Over the next decade, Zaha Hadid produced some of the most extraordinary architectural proposals of the late 20th century, and almost none of them were built. There was the Kurfürstendamm office building in Berlin 1986, a competition entry that imagined a tower as a cluster of intersecting beams, a three-dimensional grid that seemed to rotate in space. Not built, there was the Düsseldorf Art and Media Center 1989, a cultural complex that looked like folded paper, like origami at urban scale. Not built. There was the Victoria City Areal in Berlin 1988, a master plan that proposed to knit together the divided city with a new kind of public space, fluid and continuous. Not built. She won competitions, but clients backed out, or chose the second-place entry, or decided they wanted something more conventional after all. She was invited to participate in exhibitions, to give lectures, to teach. But commissions, actual projects with budgets and construction schedules, remained elusive. Part of the problem was technological. Zaha's designs were genuinely difficult to build with the tools and techniques available in the 1980s. Her geometries were not orthogonal. Her buildings did not consist of walls meeting floors at right angles, of columns supporting beams in the usual way. They were curvilinear, or they were made of intersecting planes at acute angles, or they involved complex doubly curved surfaces that could not be easily described using traditional drafting methods. Contractors looked at her drawings and had no idea how to estimate costs. Engineers were not sure how to calculate the loads. The computer software that would eventually make such forms buildable, parametric modeling, building information modeling, sophisticated structural analysis programs, did not yet exist, or existed only in research labs, not in the offices of construction firms. Her architecture was waiting for the technology to catch up. But the problem was not only technological, it was also about who she was. Architecture is among the most male-dominated professions in the world, more so even than engineering or law. The famous architects, the ones who got the major commissions and the magazine covers, were almost all men. The gatekeepers, the clients, the developers, the competition juries, the editors were almost all men. And Zaha Hadid did not behave in the way that women in male-dominated fields were often expected to behave. She was not deferential. She did not soften her ambitions or apologize for her vision. She was confident, exacting, impatient with mediocrity, unwilling to compromise. She had a temper. She could be difficult. She made demands. All of these qualities in a male architect would have been read as signs of genius, of visionary intensity. In a woman, they were read differently. She was called a diva. She was called temperamental. Clients were nervous about hiring her. Colleagues were unsure how to work with her. The critiques of her work often had a gendered edge. Her buildings were called hysterical, excessive, irrational, terms that would never have been applied to the equally radical work of her male peers. She was aware of all this, of course. She spoke about it in interviews, though not always directly. She said once that being a woman and being Arab and being an architect were three obstacles that meant she had to be 3 times as good to get taken seriously. She said that people assumed she could not understand construction because she was a woman, that they assumed her drawings were done by men in her office, that they could not quite believe she was the author of her own work. She did not dwell on this publicly. She was not interested in being seen primarily as a victim of discrimination. But the anger was there, in the work itself, in its refusal to conform, in its sheer insistence on forms that the world kept saying were impossible. Throughout the 1980s, she supported herself by teaching. She was a visiting professor at the AA, at Harvard, at Columbia, at Yale. She taught design studios, which meant guiding students through their own projects, pushing them to be more radical, to trust their instincts, to make drawings that were seductive and strange. She was a charismatic teacher, demanding but inspiring. Students either loved her or were terrified of her, sometimes both. She told them not to apologize for their ambitions. She told them that architecture was not about making clients comfortable. She told them to draw, to paint, to make images that could not be ignored. Her own office, meanwhile, remained small. At any given time in the 1980s, there were maybe 5 or 6 people working with her, producing competition entries and speculative projects, and the occasional small commission, a table, an installation, an interior. They worked long hours in the studio that was always slightly chaotic, filled with drawings pinned to every available surface, with models in various stages of completion, with the smell of paint and fixative and coffee that had been sitting too long. And then, in 1993, something finally happened. She won a competition to design a fire station for the Vitra Furniture Campus in Weil am Rhein, Germany. It was a small project. A fire station is not a major cultural monument, but it was real. It had a client, the furniture manufacturer Rolf Fehlbaum, who was genuinely committed to experimental architecture. It had a budget. It had a site. It would be built. Zaha approached the project with the same intensity she brought to her unbuilt competition entries. She treated the fire station not as a functional shed for trucks, but as a statement, a manifesto in concrete. The building is a series of sharp, intersecting planes that seem to slice through the landscape. The walls tilt at dramatic angles. The roof lines are jagged, dynamic. There are no right angles. The spaces inside are compressed and then suddenly open, the ceilings low and then soaring. The concrete is raw, unfinished, board-marked. The whole thing feels like a diagram that has been made solid. Like a drawing that is made solid, like a drawing that has been made solid, like a drawing that has been made solid. Like a drawing that has made a signet like it in cyclicandis. The Vitra fire station opened in 1993, when Zaha was 43. It was her first built work. Photographs of it appeared in every architecture magazine. Critics traveled to Weil am Rhein to see it. Some loved it. Some thought it was inhuman, more sculpture than architecture. But no one could ignore it. The building proved something important, that her designs were not unbuildable, that her formal language could exist in the world, that the geometries she had been proposing for 15 years could be realized in steel and concrete and glass. The fire station was not a comfortable building. It was not easy to use as a fire station. In fact, Vitra stopped using it as a fire station. Within a few years and converted it into an exhibition space. But it was, unapologetically, itself. It did not compromise. It looked like nothing else on earth. After Vitra, commissions began to arrive, slowly at first, then with increasing frequency. There was the LF1 Landscape Formation Pavilion in Weil am Rhein, built in 1999, a smaller structure that continued the formal language of the fire station, sharp angles, tilted planes, a sense of movement frozen in concrete. There was the Berghausl ski jump in Innsbruck, completed in 2002, a structure that looks like a spaceship about to launch, cantilevered over the slope of the mountain, its observation deck accessible by a funicular that runs through the jump's slender tower. The ski jump is both infrastructure and sculpture, functional and utterly strange, a building that acknowledges the landscape but refuses to blend in. There was the Ordrupgard Museum extension in Copenhagen 2005, a low black volume that slices into the hillside next to a historic manor house. Its interior organized as a continuous ramp that spirals gently upward through galleries. But it was the commission for the Rosenthal Center for Contemporary Art in Cincinnati, completed in 2003, that began to shift the conversation. Cincinnati was not an obvious place for radical architecture. It was a mid-sized American city in the Midwest, known more for its conservative German heritage than for experimental culture. But the museum's director, Charles Desmarais, was determined to build something extraordinary, and he convinced the board to hire Zaha Hadid. The building she designed is a response to the peculiar constraints of the site, a narrow lot on a corner in downtown Cincinnati, surrounded by undistinguished commercial buildings. Zaha's solution was to treat the facade as a series of interlocking volumes, almost like a Jenga tower, with each floor slightly different in size and shape, some projecting forward, some recessed. The entrance is not grand, it is almost hidden, a dark slot between two volumes that draws you in from the street. Inside, the galleries are organized around what she called the urban carpet, a folded concrete surface that flows from the sidewalk outside up into the building, becoming floor and then wall and then ceiling, a continuous ribbon of space that refuses the normal separation between outside and inside. The New York Times architecture critic Herbert Musham, who was one of Zaha's most eloquent champions, called the Rosenthal Center the most important American building to be completed since the Cold War. It was a dramatic claim, but it was also a measure of how radical the building felt, how unlike anything else being built in the United States at the time. The Rosenthal Center was not particularly large, and it was not located in a major cultural capital, but it demonstrated that Zaha's architecture could be both visionary and functional, that it could accommodate the messy realities of program and budget, and use without losing its formal intensity. Museum directors and curators came to Cincinnati to see it. Galleries flowed into each other in unexpected ways. The building itself was part of the exhibition, part of what you experienced as you moved through it. In 2004, Zaha Hadid was awarded the Pritzker Prize, the most prestigious honor in architecture, often called the Nobel Prize of the field. She was the first woman to receive it. The prize came with a citation that praised her dynamic and innovative forms and her quest for complex, fluid architectural spaces. The announcement made international news. Zaha was 60 years old. She had been practicing for a quarter of a century. She had produced some of the most visionary architectural drawings of the late 20th century, and had spent most of her career being told that her work was unbuildable, impossible, too radical for the real world. And now, finally, the profession was acknowledging what a small group of critics and fellow architects had known all along, that she was one of the most important architects of her generation, that her work had redefined what architecture could be, that she had pushed the discipline into territories it had never explored before. The Pritzker changed things. It gave her work a kind of official validation that opened doors. Developers and municipal governments who might have been nervous about hiring her before now saw her as a safe bet, or at least a prestigious one. Her office began to grow. By the mid-2000s, Zaha Hadid architects employed more than 100 people, working on projects all over the world. The studio moved to a larger space in Clerkenwell in an old Victorian schoolhouse that Zaha's office converted into a sprawling open-plan workspace. The atmosphere was intense, almost cult-like. People worked extraordinary hours. The office culture was demanding, sometimes brutal. Zaha herself was a forceful presence, reviewing every project, every drawing, pushing her team to go further, to refine, to eliminate anything conventional or weak. She had a precise visual memory and could spot an error or an inconsistency at a glance. She did not tolerate mediocrity. Some people thrived in that environment, others burned out and left. The projects that began to emerge from Zaha Hadid architects in the 2000s were unlike anything the office had done before, not because the formal language had changed, it had not, fundamentally, but because the scale and ambition had increased. These were not small fire stations or museum extensions. These were major cultural monuments, urban landmarks, buildings that would define cities. The MAXXI, the National Museum of 21st Century Arts in Rome, was the first and perhaps the most significant of these. The commission came in 1998, but the building was not completed until 2010, a 12-year process that involved navigating the complexities of building in a historic city, dealing with archaeological discoveries on the site, managing budgets that spiraled and then contracted, and, above all, convincing skeptical Italian authorities that this strange, fluid building was appropriate for a former military barracks in the Flaminio neighborhood of Rome. The site was a collection of old barracks buildings, most of which were demolished to make way for the museum. Zaha's design treated the museum not as a single building, but as a series of interlocking volumes, or rather as a single continuous space that folds and branches and loops back on itself. The structure is organized around a series of ramps and walkways, so that the experience of moving through the museum is more like walking through a city than through a conventional gallery. There are no discrete rooms, no enfilade of spaces that you move through in sequence. Instead, the interior is a kind of three-dimensional maze or a river with tributaries, where paths split and converge and you are never quite sure where you are in relation to where you started. The walls are white, but they curve and tilt so that the light moves across them in complex ways. The ceilings are black, which has the effect of making them recede, of creating the illusion that the space extends further upward than it actually does. Skylights cut through the roof at odd angles, bringing natural light deep into the interior. The exterior is equally strange. The building is low-slung, mostly 2 or 3 stories, and it does not have a single dominant facade. Instead, it presents different faces to different streets, each one a composition of white concrete walls that seem to fold and intersect at unpredictable angles. The surfaces are smooth, almost ceramic. The lines are crisp. There is nothing aggressive, there is nothing aggregative, nothing applied. The building's form is entirely structural, or at least it looks that way. The walls are not load-bearing in the traditional sense, but they appear to be, which gives the building a quality of inevitability as though it could not have been designed any other way. The MAXXI won the Sterling Prize in 2011, the most prestigious architectural award in the United Kingdom. By the time it opened, it was already being discussed as one of the defining buildings of the 21st century. Critics compared it to the Guggenheim in Bilbao, not because the buildings look anything alike, but because both were seen as proof that radical architecture could be popular, could attract visitors, could transform the cultural life of a city. The comparison was apt in some ways and misleading in others. The Guggenheim is a sculptural object, a single grand gesture. The MAXXI is more complex, more labyrinthine, harder to photograph because it resists a single iconic view. But both buildings share a quality of strangeness, a formal invention that feels almost alien, as though they had arrived from some other timeline, where architecture evolved differently. The MAXXI established a template, or at least a set of strategies, that Zaha would return to in other projects. The use of interior circulation as the primary organizing principle, the refusal of the box of the room as a discrete unit, the treatment of walls and ceilings as continuous surfaces rather than separate elements, the way light is brought in from unexpected angles, the sense that the building is in motion, that it is about to unfold or transform. All of these ideas appear in different forms in the other major projects of her maturity. The Heydar Aliyev Center in Baku, Azerbaijan, completed in 2012, is the most extreme expression of Zaha's formal language, the building where every right angle has been banished, where every surface curves. The site is in the center of Baku, and the brief called for a cultural center with an auditorium, exhibition spaces, and administrative offices. Zaha's response was to design a building that has no walls in the conventional sense. Instead, the structure is a single continuous surface that flows from the ground up and over the building and back down to the ground on the other side. The effect is of a landscape that has been folded into architecture, or of a giant piece of fabric that has been draped over the site and then frozen. The exterior is clad in white fiberglass reinforced concrete panels, each one slightly different in shape, each one part of the larger curve. There are no visible joints, no seams. The building appears seamless, monolithic, even though it is in fact an enormously complex assembly of thousands of individual pieces. Inside, the same flowing forms continue. The lobby is a vast, white, undulating space where floor becomes wall becomes ceiling in a continuous sweep. There are no columns, no obvious structure. The ceiling is perforated with circular skylights that create patterns of light and shadow on the white surfaces below. Ramps and staircases flow organically from the main space, leading to the auditorium and galleries. The effect is disorienting in the best sense. You are inside a building, but it does not feel like any interior you have experienced before. It feels liquid, almost biological, as though you are inside the body of some enormous creature. The Heydar Aliyev Center won the Design Museum's Design of the Year award in 2014, but it was also controversial. The building was commissioned by the government of Azerbaijan, an authoritarian regime with a poor human rights record, and it was named after Heydar Aliyev, the country's former president and the father of the current president, Ilham Aliyev. Critics accused Zaha of being complicit in the regime's efforts to use spectacular architecture as a form of propaganda, to burnish its image on the international stage while suppressing dissent at home. Zaha responded that architecture was not inherently political in the way her critics suggested, that architects work for all kinds of clients, that refusing to build in countries with problematic governments would mean abandoning those places entirely. It was an argument that satisfied almost no one. The debate raised uncomfortable questions about the ethics of architectural practice, about what responsibilities, if any, architects have for the uses to which their buildings are put, about whether a beautiful building can be separated from the political context that produced it. These were questions that followed Zaha through the last years of her career. Many of her major projects were in the Middle East and Asia, regions where the clients were often governments or government-linked corporations, where labor rights were weak and migrant workers were exploited, where the money funding the construction came from oil wealth or state development funds. The Al Wakra Stadium in Qatar, designed for the 2022 World Cup, faced intense scrutiny because of reports about the working conditions of the laborers building it, many of whom were migrant workers from South Asia living in appalling conditions. Zaha's office issued statements saying they had no control over labor practices, that their responsibility was for the design, not the construction. But critics argued that architects could not absolve themselves so easily, that by taking commissions in countries with poor labor protections, they were implicitly endorsing those systems. Zaha herself was impatient with these criticisms. She argued that architects should build where they were invited to build, that architecture could have a positive impact even in difficult contexts, that the solution to global inequality was not for Western architects to boycott developing countries. She was also, it must be said, someone who had spent her entire career fighting to be taken seriously, fighting to get commissions, and she was not inclined to turn down major projects for reasons that seemed to her abstract or hypocritical, especially when male architects working on similar projects faced far less scrutiny. There's no easy resolution to this. The criticisms were real and substantial. So was the double standard. But to focus only on the controversies is to miss what the buildings themselves were doing, the ways they were expanding the formal vocabulary of architecture, pushing the discipline into new territory. The London Aquatic Centre, built for the 2012 Olympics, is a case in point. The building is organized around a single grand gesture, a sweeping, wave-like roof that spans the length of the structure, rising and falling in a continuous curve. The roof is made of timber and steel, clad in aluminum panels, and it appears to float above the two swimming pools and diving pool below. The interior is vast and bright, with daylight flooding in through glazed walls at either end. The roof's curve creates a sense of flow, of movement, that seems entirely appropriate for a building dedicated to swimming. The structure is expressive without being arbitrary. The form is both sculptural and functional, providing the necessary clear spans for the pools while also creating a dramatic space. Similarly, the Riverside Museum in Glasgow, completed in 2011, is a museum of transport that takes as its primary formal idea the movement of people and goods along the River Clyde, which runs past the site. The building is a long, low structure with a zigzagging roofline that rises and falls in a series of sharp peaks and valleys. The exterior is clad in zinc panels, weathered and industrial in feel. Inside, the space is organized as a single continuous gallery with exhibits arranged along a central corridor that runs the length of the building. The roof structure is expressed in the interior, creating a rhythm of light and shadow, of compression and expansion. The building feels like a shed or a warehouse, which is appropriate for a transport museum, but it is also unmistakably contemporary, unmistakably Zaha. By the 2010s, Zaha Hadid Architects was one of the most sought-after firms in the world. The office had projects on every continent, apartment towers in Miami and Manhattan, an opera house in Guangzhou, a stadium in Tokyo, a cultural center in Rabat, a luxury resort in the Caribbean, high-speed rail stations in Italy and Saudi Arabia. The scale of the practice had changed completely from the small, scrappy office of the 1980s. There were now more than 300 people working under Zaha's name, organized into project teams, each led by a senior architect, with Zaha and her partner Patrick Schumacher reviewing and directing the overall vision. Schumacher, a German architect and theorist who had joined the office in the late 1980s, had become Zaha's closest collaborator, the person who translated her formal instincts into a theoretical framework, who developed the parametric tools and digital workflows that made the office's complex geometries feasible. He was controversial in his own right, an outspoken libertarian who made provocative statements about architecture and politics, but his technical and intellectual contributions to the office were undeniable. Zaha's own role had shifted. She was no longer sitting at a drafting table producing the paintings and drawings that had defined her early career. She was directing, editing, making decisions about form and proportion and detail, but the actual production of the work was done by her large team. This is normal in major architectural practices. No single person can design 100 projects simultaneously. But it raised questions about authorship, about what it means to say a building is by Zaha Hadid when she did not personally draw it. The answer, as with any architect who runs a large office, is that the work reflects her vision, her sensibility, her standards. She set the direction. She judged whether a design was strong enough, whether it had the formal clarity and intensity that her work demanded. She was, in a sense, like a film director, the person whose creative vision unified the efforts of a large team. There is a late photograph of Zaha in her office, surrounded by models of projects under construction. She is wearing black, as she almost always did in her later years. Her hair is silver, cut in a sharp bob. Her expression is focused, evaluating. Behind her, the models look like abstract sculptures, like pieces in an exhibition rather than buildings. There is a quality of command in the image, of someone who has earned her authority, who does not need to justify her presence anymore. She looks exactly like what she is, one of the most important architects in the world. But there is also a kind of loneliness in that photograph, though perhaps that is reading too much into a single image. Zaha never married. She had no children. She sometimes said that her work was her life, that she did not have room for anything else, that the demands of architecture, especially for someone fighting the battles she had to fight, left no space for domesticity. Friends and colleagues spoke about her warmth, her loyalty, her sense of humor, but also about her isolation, the way she could be surrounded by people and still seem apart, unreachable. She traveled constantly, moving from site to site, from lecture to lecture, from one hotel room to another. She collected art and furniture, filling her apartment in London with pieces by her contemporaries, with modernist classics, with objects that reflected her sensibility. But she lived alone. In late March of 2016, Zaha flew to Miami for a site visit. She was working on several projects in the city, a residential tower, a parking garage that she had designed as a sculptural object in its own right. She was not feeling well. She had been experiencing chest pains, shortness of breath. She checked herself into a hospital in Miami. The doctors discovered that she was suffering from a heart attack. They treated her, but there were complications. On March 31, 2016, Zaha Hadid died. She was 65 years old. The news was shocking. She had seemed unstoppable, indestructible, someone who would go on designing buildings until she was 90. Her death was announced on social media before the official statements went out, and within hours, tributes began pouring in from all over the world. Architects, artists, critics, politicians, everyone acknowledged the magnitude of the loss. Norman Foster called her a great architect, a wonderful person, and an inspiring teacher. Rem Koolhaas said that she had been a revolutionary who changed the way we think about architecture. Patrick Schumacher, in a statement on behalf of the office, said that the work would continue, that the projects in progress would be completed, that Zaha's vision would endure. And the work did continue. Zaha Hadid Architects remains one of the largest and most influential practices in the world. The projects that Zaha was working on when she died, the stadium in Tokyo, the metro stations in Riyadh, the tower in Manhattan, have been completed. New commissions continue to arrive. Schumacher has assumed the role of principal, and the office's formal language has, if anything, become even more extreme, even more insistent on complex curves and parametric forms. But there is an inevitable question about what it means for the office to continue without Zaha. Whether the work has the same intensity, the same sense of necessity, without her presence to judge and refine and push it further. These are questions that every major architectural practice faces when its founder dies. Some continue successfully for decades, others drift, lose their direction, become brands rather than creative engines. What is not in question is the significance of what Zaha accomplished in her lifetime. She changed the shape of architecture, literally and figuratively. She proved that buildings did not have to be boxes, that space could be fluid and dynamic, that architecture could be as formally inventive as sculpture or painting without ceasing to function as architecture. She demonstrated that the avant-garde ideas of the early 20th century, the Russian constructivists, the Italian futurists, could be realized in built form, that they were not just utopian fantasies, but real possibilities waiting for the technology and the will to build them. She created a body of work that is instantly recognizable, that has a visual language entirely its own, that can be spotted from a distance or in a photograph before you even know what building you are looking at. She was also, of course, the first woman to win the Pritzker Prize, the first woman to be acknowledged at the highest level of the architectural profession. This is a fact that cannot be separated from her legacy. It matters. It matters because it reveals how recent and how fragile the inclusion of women in architecture still is, how few women have been given the opportunities that men have taken for granted, how much talent has been wasted because of assumptions about who can and cannot design buildings. Zaha's success did not end discrimination in architecture. The profession remains overwhelmingly male, and women architects still face barriers that their male colleagues do not. But it made a certain kind of denial impossible. No one could say anymore that women were not capable of visionary architecture, not when Zaha Hadid had produced the Heydar Aliyev Center, the MAXXI, the Guangzhou Opera House, buildings that were as ambitious and radical as any in the world. There is a temptation when writing about Zaha to make her story into a simple narrative of triumph, of the outsider who overcomes all obstacles and achieves greatness. And that is part of the story, certainly. She did overcome enormous obstacles. She did achieve greatness. But the story is also more complicated than that, more ambiguous. She worked for authoritarian regimes. She built in countries with exploitive labor practices. She ran an office that some found exhilarating and others found oppressive. She was, by all accounts, a difficult person, demanding, uncompromising, impatient with anything less than excellence. These things do not cancel out her achievements, but they are part of the full picture, part of what it means to be an architect operating at the highest levels of global capital and power, navigating the compromises and contradictions that come with that territory. Her buildings remain. They stand in cities around the world, and they will continue to stand for decades, probably for centuries. They will weather and age. They will be maintained or neglected. They will be loved or criticized or simply taken for granted, the way all buildings eventually are. But they will not disappear. The MAXXI will still be in Rome, its white walls folding through the Flaminio neighborhood. The Heydar Aliyev Center will still be in Rome, its white walls folding through the Flaminio neighborhood. The London Aquatic Centre will still be in Stratford, its wave roof floating above the pools. These buildings are part of the world now, part of the built environment that shapes how people move through space, how they experience architecture, how they understand what a building can be. There is a late drawing, one of the last Zaha made before her death, or at least one of the last that was exhibited publicly. It is a painting, really, a large canvas covered in fluid, overlapping brushstrokes in black and red and white. The forms are abstract, but they suggest architecture, suggest structure, suggest space unfolding. There is a sense of movement, of energy, of something still becoming. It is impossible to say what building it represents, if it represents any building at all. It might be a study for a project. It might be a reflection on the work as a whole. It might simply be an image, a moment of visual thinking made concrete in paint. But looking at it, you can feel the continuity with her student work from the 1970s, with the early competition drawings, with all the paintings she made over 5 decades. The same lines, the same dynamic space, the same refusal to settle into stasis. Zaha once said that there were 360 degrees in a circle, so why were architects building at only 90 degrees? It was a characteristically provocative statement, one that reduced the entire history of orthogonal architecture to a failure of imagination. But it also captured something essential about her approach, the belief that the existing conditions, the accepted norms, the way things have always been done, were not inevitable, were not natural, were simply choices that could be unchosen, forms that could be reimagined. She spent her career proving that buildings could be otherwise, that architecture did not have to submit to the right angle, that space could flow and curve and fold, that the future might look like something other than a grid of boxes. And in proving that, she changed what was possible. Not just for architects, though certainly for them. Every architecture student in the world now knows that buildings can be curvilinear, that software can model complex geometries, that construction techniques exist to realize forms that would have been impossible a generation ago. But also for everyone else, for the people who walk through her buildings, who experience space differently, because she imagined it differently. Architecture operates at a strange remove from its audience. Most people do not think about buildings, at least not consciously. They move through them, use them, register them peripherally. But the shapes and spaces we inhabit affect us, shape our sense of what is normal, what is beautiful, what is possible. Zaha's buildings do not let you ignore them. They demand attention. They make you aware of space, of form, of the fact that someone decided this building should look this way, that another shape, another experience was possible. In the years since her death, her work has been the subject of retrospectives, of monographs, of academic conferences and critical reassessments. Some of the controversies have continued. Debates about labor practices, about working with authoritarian clients, about the environmental impact of her buildings, which are often energy-intensive and expensive to maintain. Some critics have argued that her architecture is more about spectacle than substance, that the formal complexity is an end in itself rather than a response to program or context. Others have argued the opposite, that her buildings are deeply attentive to sight and use, that the flowing forms create experiences that are richer and more nuanced than the static geometries of conventional architecture. Both perspectives have merit. Zaha's buildings are spectacular. Absolutely. They are also, at their best, thoughtful responses to the specific challenges of place and program. What is clear, in any case, is that the work will endure. It will be studied and debated and imitated and critiqued for as long as people care about architecture, about form, about the ways we shape space and the ways space shapes us. Zaha Hadid was not a perfect architect, if such a thing even exists. She was a human being, with all the contradictions and compromises that entails. But she was also unquestionably a visionary, someone who saw possibilities that others did not see, who insisted on making forms that the world said were impossible, who built a body of work that expanded the language of architecture in ways that cannot be undone. There is a story that one of her students tells about a crit at the Architectural Association in the early 2000s. A student presented a project that was ambitious but safe, a design that took Zaha's formal language and made it predictable, made it easy. Zaha looked at it for a long time, not saying anything. The room was silent. Finally she said, "You are designing like you are afraid someone will tell you no." The student did not know what to say. Zaha continued, "Do not design like you are afraid. Design like you are the only one who can see what needs to be there." It was advice she had followed her entire life. She designed without fear, or at least without letting fear stop her. She designed like she was the only one who could see the building that needed to be there, the shape that the site demanded, the form that the future required. And she insisted on that vision, even when no one else could see it, even when the world said no, even when it took decades for the world to catch up. And the world did catch up. Eventually. The technology improved. The attitude shifted. The commissions arrived. But by then, she had already been working for 30 years, had already produced some of the most extraordinary architectural visions of the 20th century, had already proven that she was not interested in permission, that she would make the work whether it was built or not, whether she was celebrated or ignored. The fact that she finally received recognition, that she finally got to build at the scale her imagination demanded, is important. But it is not the whole story. The whole story includes all those years in the wilderness, all those unbuilt projects, all those competition entries that went nowhere, all that time when she kept working because the work itself was what mattered, because the vision was real even if the buildings were not yet. There is a quality in her buildings, especially the late ones, of having always been there, of having emerged from the site rather than being imposed on it. The MAXXI feels like it grew out of the Roman streets around it, like it has always been part of the city's fabric. The Heydar Aliyev Center feels like a natural formation, like something that rose from the earth in Baku. This is a paradox, because the buildings are also utterly alien, utterly unlike anything in their contexts. But the best architecture has this quality of inevitability, of feeling both strange and necessary, as though the site had been waiting for this form, as though the building had always been latent in the landscape, and the architect's job was simply to reveal it. Zaha understood this. She spoke often about landscape, about how buildings should emerge from the ground, should be continuous with the topography, rather than separate from it. She rejected the modernist idea that architecture should be a pure object, a white box hovering above the earth. She wanted her buildings to be embedded, to flow, to acknowledge the specificity of place even as they transformed it. This is why so many of her buildings have ramps and sloping floors, why they resist the flat datum of the ground plane, why they seem to be in motion. They are not static objects, they are processes, events, experiences that unfold in time as you move through them. And movement, finally, is what her architecture is about. Not movement in the literal sense of cars and trains and pedestrians, though those are often present, but movement as a formal principle, as an organizing idea. Her buildings look like they are moving. They look like they are moving. They look like they have been captured mid-transformation, frozen at the moment between one state and another. This is what makes them dynamic, what gives them their energy. They refuse stasis. They refuse the idea that architecture is a fixed object, a permanent solution. They propose instead that architecture can be fluid, provisional, responsive, alive. She made buildings that looked like the future, and now they are part of the present. They have been absorbed into the visual language of the 21st century, into the catalog of what architecture can be. Students study them. Tourists photograph them. Cities use them as symbols, as evidence of modernity and ambition. The forms that Zaha invented have been copied and diluted and turned into clichés by lesser architects who understood the shapes, but not the thinking behind them. This is what happens to every radical idea when it becomes successful. It gets mainstreamed. It gets commodified. The risk disappears. The original becomes just one example among many, but the original work remains distinct. You can see the difference between a Zaha Hadid building and an imitation. The difference is in the rigor, the precision, the way every line and curve and surface has been thought through, has been tested and refined and judged against an internal standard that will not accept anything approximate or lazy. The difference is in the commitment to the vision, the unwillingness to compromise when compromise would make the building easier or cheaper or more palatable. The difference is in the intensity, the sense that the building matters, that it is not just another project, but a statement, an argument, a proposition about what the world should look like. Zaha Hadid spent her life making that argument. She made it in drawings and paintings and models and buildings. She made it in lectures and interviews and design studios. She made it through sheer persistence, through the refusal to give up or give in or accept that the obstacles in her path were insurmountable. She made it as a woman in a profession that did not want her. She made it as an Arab in a Western-dominated field. She made it as an architect whose formal language was too radical for most clients, too difficult for most contractors, too strange for most critics. She made it anyway, and in making it, she changed the shape of architecture, changed what is possible, changed what we can imagine when we think about buildings, about space, about the forms that human beings can create. The work is there. It will remain. It will outlast the controversies and the critiques and the assessments. It will outlast the people who loved it and the people who hated it. It will outlast memory of the woman who made it, eventually, as all work does. But for now, in this moment, we can still see the connection between the buildings and the person, between the forms and the vision that produced them. We can still recognize that these buildings came from somewhere, from someone, that they were not inevitable, but were willed into being by an intelligence and an imagination that refused to accept the world as it was, that insisted on making it otherwise. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is what we ask of our visionaries, not that they solve all problems, not that they be perfect, but that they show us what we could not see before, that they make real what seemed impossible, that they expand the field of possibility so that the rest of us can imagine further, dream stranger, build more bravely. Zaha Hadid did that. She made buildings that did not exist before she imagined them. She made a world that is richer and stranger and more various because she was in it. She made forms that will endure long after the arguments about them have faded, forms that will continue to shape space and experience and the way we understand what architecture can be. Somewhere in Rome, the white walls of the MAXXI are still folding through their galleries, still creating paths that branch and converge. Somewhere in Baku, the curve of the Heydar Aliyev Center is still rising from its plaza, still catching the light. Somewhere in London, the wave roof of the Aquatic Center is still floating above its pools. The buildings are there. They are in the world. They are what she made, and they are what remains.